I want to bring us to a video of JD Vance talking about this issue on CBS's Face the Nation. This was in response to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops putting out a statement that was criticizing Donald Trump's decision to issue an executive order that basically allows, contra old policy, immigration enforcement to happen at so called sensitive places. So, places like schools and churches. The Catholic bishops are extremely opposed to this, and JD Vance had some very choice words for them. If we could just roll that clip.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops this week condemned some of the executive orders signed by President Trump, specifically those allowing immigration and customs enforcement to enter churches and to enter schools. Do you personally support the idea of conducting a raid or enforcement action in a church service, at a school?
Well, let me address this. Of course, if you have a person who is convicted of a violent crime, whether they're an illegal immigrant or a non-illegal immigrant, you have to go and get that person to protect the public safety. That's not unique to immigration. But let me just address this particular issue, Margaret, because as a practicing Catholic, I was actually heartbroken by that statement. And I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops needs to actually look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that when they receive over $100 million to help resettle illegal immigrants, are they worried about humanitarian concerns, or are they actually worried about their bottom line? We are going to enforce immigration law. We're going to protect the American people.
Yeah.
Donald Trump promised to do that. And I believe the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, if they're worried about the humanitarian costs of immigration enforcement, let them talk about the children who have been sex trafficked because of the wide open border of Joe Biden.
You personally
let them talk
support them
about
going into
people like
schools
Laken
and
Riley
churches.
who were brutally murdered. I support us doing law enforcement against violent criminals, whether they're illegal immigrants or anybody else, in a way that keeps us safe. Let me ask this question, Margaret. Let's separate the immigration issue. If you had a violent murderer in a school, of course I want law enforcement to go and get that person out.
Of course.
So what's the point of the question?
You changed the regulation this week. That's the point of the question.
Exactly.
Giving the authority to go into churches and go into schools.
We empowered law enforcement to enforce
But
the
that
law
also
everywhere
has
to protect
knock-on
Americans.
Effect, a chilling effect, arguably, to people to not send their kids to school.
I desperately hope it has a chilling effect on illegal immigrants coming
U.S.
into our
Conference
country.
of Catholic Bishops are actively hiding criminals from
I think the U.S.
law
Conference
enforcement?
of Catholic Bishops has frankly not been a good partner in common sense immigration enforcement that the American people voted for. And I hope, again, as a devout Catholic, that they'll do better.
So this is obviously a pretty insane clip, in part because Vance is accusing basically the Catholic Church of being motivated not by any sort of missional belief or devoutly held belief, but rather because of financial interest. But the other thing that really bothered me about this clip is it felt like Vance just kept switching. It's almost like the Mott and Bailey fallacy. Like he just kept moving the goalposts and switching what he was talking about, right? He was talking about seekers. He's talking about refugees. He's talking about other varieties of immigrant. What's your reaction to Vance there? And could you also break down for our viewership what exactly the difference between a refugee, an asylum seeker, and any other category is, and how somebody who's maybe concerned about the number of crossings at the border should interpret these groups' sort of relative threat or the degree of vetting?
Yeah, thanks. The most vetted group is refugees, formally resettled in the United States. Refugees are screened abroad to see if they meet the definition of a refugee, someone who's fled their home country because they're facing persecution on certain grounds, certain protected grounds. If they meet that definition, if they are particularly vulnerable, if they undergo background checks and security checks and health checks, they may be resettled in the United States. They might be resettled in another country, but they're fully vetted. And then they're flown to the United States as a legal refugee, and they're on a path to permanent resident status and citizenship. That's who the government is funding the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to resettle in the United States for the most part. Um, Asylum seekers are people who come to the United States, whether they come across the border, whether they come on a tourist visa, whether they come on a work visa like an H-1B visa. And then they say, I'm afraid to go home. I want protection here. I would face persecution at home. They're entitled to a process. They might apply affirmatively with our U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They might apply as part of their removal proceedings in immigration courts, but they have a right to present those claims of why they're afraid to go home and see if they meet our pretty narrow definition of who qualifies for asylum in the United States. If they're granted asylum, they're a legal immigrant, they're on a path to permanent resident status and citizenship. Other people come across the border and they might be openly here for economic reasons. They might just, not be able to feed their kids at home, or they see a lot of opportunity in the United States and they come across the border without authorization, or they came through the CBP-1 process when that was there. And they're here, but they really wouldn't qualify for asylum. They have no claim to legal status in the United States. They just know that for themselves, living and working illegally in the US is a better option than some of the alternatives.
Is the Well, what's the role exactly of the church in resettling refugees, for example? And do they play a role with asylum seekers or just for with refugees?
So we have 9 big resettlement organizations across the United States that help to place refugees, and help provide short-term and longer-term resettlement services. Refugees, until the pause in funding that we're under right now, were eligible for 90 days of help with housing, transportation, figuring out how to get a job, figuring out how to get their kids in school, signing up for benefits that refugees are eligible for on a short-term basis. A lot of local resettlement organizations are local affiliates of some of these big national organizations. There's a Catholic one, a Jewish one, a Lutheran one. There's some that are not religiously affiliated. Um, and so those are services primarily for refugees. If somebody is granted asylum, they can also get some of the services that are available for refugees, some of the longer term services like help finding work, maybe some case management in some places. But asylum seekers often don't know that they're eligible for those services. They don't always take up those services. Many times they've been living in the United States. They're self-sufficient. They don't need anyone to help them. So that's the role of refugee resettlement agencies.
And if the government is, in a sense, outsourcing this process to groups like the Catholic Church, what is the first of all, how much does it cost generally? Do you have like a ballpark figure of like how much money does the government spend to resettle a refugee?
I should know, and I don't have that figure in my
Yeah.
head, but basically refugees get help with they get a loan for their flight, then they have to pay that back. They get
With
help with a couple of months of rent. They get a small amount of cash for their very earliest days. Volunteers will set up an apartment for them, make sure that there's food in the fridge when they arrive. Like I said, they'll get help with transportation, enrolling kids in school, and then refugees are helped and expected to become self-sufficient very quickly. That's the main goal of the refugee resettlement program is to get refugees into jobs and to get them off of public benefits, so that they can be self-sufficient. Often those are jobs in meat processing plants and hotels. They're not high-wage jobs, but they give people at least a foot in the door and some income so they can learn English and work on their broader integration.
One thing I've really been struggling with lately, and I'm wondering whether you can convince me to feel differently about it, is I'm a New York City resident and we have had a massive influx of migrants to city run shelters. And under the city's right to shelter consent decree, which I believe is sort of in legal limbo now, and Mayor Adams has, done a little bit of rethinking of that. Um, Basically, I mean, we had newcomers who were handed EBT cards and prepaid debit cards and given places to sleep at shelters, and hotels made deals with the city. And we had, hotel rooms purchased by the city as part of these contracts, sometimes for, chump change, other times for 200, 300, $350 a night. I went through all of the city documents to actually see what do these contracts look like because it was really bothering me. Not because I object to the idea of trying to help people enter this country and begin to build a life here, but rather because an awful lot of money is taken from the, median New York City taxpayer, myself included. And it feels very frustrating to feel as though we have public schools that aren't functioning the way that I want, sanitation that's not as good as I want it to be. And yet at the same time, it feels a little bit like the city has set itself up to be in this really bad spot where originally the consent decree was focused on ensuring that homeless people basically don't live on the streets in New York. And now a bunch of people who recently crossed the border caught news of this and have flocked to the city. And it's very hard for cost of living to be as high as it is and for the amount to be taken from taxpayers, and then to have people who arrived last week be handed prepaid debit cards and hotel rooms.
That
How
slide, by the way, Liz, that I was bringing
Mhm.
up, this is the state spending on asylum seekers, different category than refugees, but it just gives you a
Mhm.
snapshot of, like, there's definitely been an increase in, public money going to resettle these refugees, and obviously New York City declared a state of emergency, right? So
Yeah,
there's,
and this is broken
so
down by month, like, each little bar is each month of 2023 and 2024,
right.
correct? Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, so
that's right.
it's something where, like, I've been living in New York since 2020, and it's very obvious, what's going on here. How do you look at this? Do you see this as New York City having shot itself in the foot? Do you see it as something where other cities should adopt this model and try to emulate the same thing? What do you think of this, and can you convince me, a slightly pissed off New Yorker, to maybe feel a little differently about what's going on?
Yeah, I think that the what happened in New York City, what's been happening in New York City shows two different kinds of failures. So
Mm.
one of those kinds of failures is that people who come across the border who say that they're afraid to go home, they're put into removal proceedings. They can ask for asylum in those removal proceedings, or traditionally they've been able to. Those rules have been shifting. Um, and then they have to wait 7 or more years to find out if they're going to be granted asylum. Meantime, they can work after they wait for 6 months, they can get work authorization. Their kids are in schools, they're meeting friends, they're putting down all kinds of roots in the United States. Um, and maybe sometimes they're ending up in New York City shelters while they're waiting for these immigration court proceedings to proceed. In many cases, at the end of that, they'll be removed. They'll be told, you don't qualify for asylum. You have no right to stay in the United States. We need to have a system where people who ask for protection get a decision much, much faster. It needs to be, a matter of months. There has to be due process, but letting people in for years, in some cases needing support, that doesn't benefit anybody.
In a sense, it's very odd, this idea, like, I'm almost more frustrated by the idea of them being deported after a short period of time because it's like, okay, well, the taxpayers don't actually get any of that money back, but then these people don't actually become integrated into our communities and become our neighbors and become important parts of our economy, right? And so that kind of feels possibly like the worst of both worlds, both for the taxpayers and for the actual migrants. Is that correct?
You're saying if they had a faster adjudication of their asylum claims, or
Yeah,
or
I
in the
think it
situation
would
where
it would maybe be a more defensible situation to have it be like, an asylum seeker is immediately given a decision, immediately given work authorization, and maybe there's 1 month of city provided social services, 1 month of shelter in the New York City hotels, and 1 month of a prepaid debit card. But the idea is very much this person has a clear pathway to being able to work in this country, and they will actually be integrated. They will become a part of New York City. They are New York City's future. That would bother me, I think, less than the sort of transient thing that we're currently seeing where people are, I think, by no fault of their own really in left in the lurch legally, but it results in a situation where New Yorkers are sort of expected to feed and clothe our neighbors, though they may just be our neighbors for a few months, right?
or maybe a few years because
Yeah.
it will take that long. Yeah. Yeah, and then the other failure is, there's always gonna be people who make it into the United States. We're gonna have periods where border arrivals are high, we're gonna have periods where they're low. We need to figure out a better system for making sure that people go to communities where they can be successful. It is really hard to get by in New York City. It's hard to afford rent, it's hard to find a job that lets you meet the basic needs of your family. If you went to Iowa or some other state where the cost of living are lower, where there's lots and lots of job opportunity, people might have an easier chance of being self-sufficient. Having so many people crowd into one city, they went there because they heard that shelter was available. They knew people in New York City. They've seen it in the movies in some cases. Just that being the decision-making process is not good. We need a better system where people can be distributed all across the United States. If there has to be a wait, maybe there doesn't have to be a wait. Maybe their cases could be decided quickly, and either people are resettled like refugees, given a few months of support, and then asked to be self-sufficient, or they're told that they can't stay in the United States and they leave more quickly before we've, expended a lot of money.
Hey, that was a clip from Just Asking Questions. You can watch another one here or the full episode here. And please subscribe to our brand new channel to get us started off right and be notified when new episodes or clips go up. Thanks for watching.